Passionate, driven, enthusiastic, euphoric. This is who we are as entrepreneurs. But how we leverage these incredible attributes to dream and build businesses that scale and grow is what this podcast is all about. Hello, I'm attorneypreneur Josh Brown, and welcome to Franchise Euphoria. Are you thinking about buying a franchise but concerned it might be a big mistake? If so, you will want to tune into this episode of Franchise Euphoria. Today, I am thrilled to be interviewing Carol Tice. Carol is a longtime business writer and also the owner of her own six-figure online business launched in 2011. Her new book is The Pocket Small Business Owner's Guide to Starting Your Business on a Shoestring. She was a staff writer at the Puget Sound Business Journal for nearly 7 years. Since 2006, she has been a full-time freelance writer and covers franchising and entrepreneurship for Forbes. Her work has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Entrepreneur, Seattle Business, Seattle Magazine, among many others. Corporate writing clients have included Costco, American Express, Dun & Bradstreet, and Dell, as well as the top websites Copyblogger, ProBlogger, Freelance Switch, and many more. I am thrilled to have her on the show, and welcome, Carol.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How are you doing today?
I am doing good.
So, you've been a writer for quite some time, and it's obvious you have a lot of experience and have been very, very successful. I'm kind of curious, have you always loved writing?
You know, I really did. My first form of writing was songwriting. That was what I pursued up until I was about 30. And then I found the kind of writing you get paid for. And I kind of never looked back and really plunged into the world of reporting and writing nonfiction and wrote for alternative publications. And then I spent 5 glamorous years writing about nothing but home improvement retailing. And that was sort of my big introduction to business, which when I got the job, I just thought, oh, this is going to be so boring. And I was totally fascinated. 5 years went by in like a blink. And that was just covering lumber yards.
Really?
But I learned everything really that I know about business from that job and from all those hardware store owners about business and how to have a profitable business and how to evaluate a business opportunity. And that really, when I got to the Puget Sound Business Journal, I started covering franchising. And so I was covering both, national franchises that would come into the Seattle area and franchisors that were based here. Including Taco Del Mar was one of the big ones that I covered, all of their many missteps. And it's all kind of a sad story. Eventually they basically went broke and the franchise was bought. The original owners kind of had to go out of the picture. And it's a successful chain today, but they aren't involved. They lost control of the company. So, I've lived through a lot of business drama like that and learned a lot about franchising in particular, the whole world of this model and when it makes sense and, when it doesn't. And, the big change that's happened in franchising since I started covering it, 15 years ago, is just that there are so many more franchise opportunities because there's all these franchise packagers out there convincing everybody with one store that they should franchise for growth. And so you get a lot of these franchises that are popping up 18 months after they opened their first store. They're wanting to sell you a franchise. And, I think you said you wanted to talk about, red flags and warning signs. And I'm very, very leery of these situations because one of the big things you want to buy with a franchise is expertise and a proven model. Well, this model isn't proven yet. It hasn't been around long enough for them to have 2 years worth of financials for you to look at. Often the original isn't profitable and they're hoping selling a bunch of franchises will make their balance sheet work. That is one of the things that makes me very, very suspicious.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, I talk with people often, businesses that, just as you said, have been in business for a year and a half, 2 years, and they get this sort of, I call it the franchise bug, where maybe they've gone online and they've read a few things and thought, wow, this is a great way for me to expand. And I always tell them, unless you have 2 or 3 operations that you're currently running right now, I wouldn't even consider franchising before I looked at 2 to 3, because there is such a big difference between running one store, as an example, versus 2 or 3. I'd be curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've got somebody, they've barely got experience operating this store, and they have no experience being a franchisor, which is actually a different job for a business owner. I mean, sometimes when you look at the background of these people, they were a McDonald's franchisee for 20 years before they started this or something. You know, there's a scenario where there is some franchise operation expertise and they have a deep background in operating businesses, but sometimes there isn't. And it's just somebody who's been sold a dream that if they franchise, they'll make millions. And the question to go back to is, what are you buying when you're buying a franchise? Why do you pay them, 6-8% royalties every month, which if you haven't operated a business, you don't know, is a big chunk of margin to give up. It may not sound like a lot, but for a lot of businesses, that's going to be the difference between making it and not giving up that royalty. And so you have to get a lot in return that's going to make the business that much more profitable, where this is all going to pencil out. And when you're buying a newer business that has no brand equity, one of the big things you're buying when you get a McDonald's franchise is it's McDonald's. People are going to drive by and go, oh, a McDonald's, let's go in, honey. I know what that is and I like it. When you buy a newer franchise, you don't have any of that. So you're essentially paying, part of the royalty is supposed to be for brand equity, but you're getting nothing on that side. You're getting nothing there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that a big part of it is brand equity. I mean, I think when you're dealing with a true starter franchise, really what people are ultimately buying is they're buying their systems and processes so they don't have to go through that exercise, right? I mean, they're doing that so as a way, a lot of people who think about getting into franchises, at least in my experience, they do so because they want to avoid, in theory, some of the mistakes that startups make. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I'm so glad you mentioned this early on, is that it's a really, really big issue, is that people, and I think it's almost a deeper seated issue, is that people fall in love with franchises.
I want to get to that topic, but hang on, because
Okay.
I want to go back to what you were saying. When you buy into an 18-month-old franchise, I'm going to say you're not even getting good systems and processes. They haven't nailed that stuff down yet. It's too early. It's not like getting a manual from McDonald's. You're going to be helping to develop those processes with them. That you're not even getting that. What you're getting when you buy into a new franchise system is ground floor opportunity. Often fees to get in are lower, and there's more. If you think this is the greatest, this is the next McDonald's, you might end up getting to own 100 stores of that because you're there at the beginning. That to me is really why people buy. And I have interviewed, at one point I did a story where I went and looked up a bunch of people who had been the first franchisee or the second, like a really early franchisee of a system, and said, why did you do this crazy thing? And that's what they said, ground floor opportunity. And of course it's true. If you are that prescient person who sees, oh wow, this is going to sweep the country, and you're getting that ground floor opportunity. So, that to me is the reason, but you have to be so circumspect. And so now let's move on to your other topic, which is people fall in love with franchises. I have interviewed so many franchise owners, and often on stories about doing due diligence for franchises. I will ask franchisors, give me some people who you think did really great due diligence to talk to so I can hear about how many different systems they compared and, how they went to the discovery days of each one. And half of those people that I hand selected as due diligence stars, when I get them on the phone, they say, I went into Taco Del Mar and I thought it was awesome and the food was great and I bought a franchise. That is what happens over and over and over. People come in and it's like a romance. It's like a romantic comedy or a tragedy. They go in and they go, oh, I love this pizza. Must own this, or whatever. The gutter cleaner comes or the Novus windshield guy and you go, man, that's a great business. I want to buy into that. And honestly, they don't do any research. And it's terrifying to me. That is absolutely terrifying to me. As a risk-averse person, let me just say, I find that terrifying.
Well, even somebody who's not risk averse, though, that's terrifying. I mean, people who are not risk averse still shouldn't do things on a whim. I mean, there's still a lot of research that goes into that. I completely agree with you. I have that experience all the time where people will come and meet with them. And the first question I ask is, so why are you interested in the franchise? And a lot of times they'll say, well, because you never see them go out of business, or I just love their sandwiches, or, whatever the case may be. And for me, it's always like, well, do you understand their underlying business model? And 9 times out of 10, they don't.
No, yeah, no idea. How profitable are they? Here's some questions I like to see people asking before they buy a franchise. How many of these franchises have been sold off, closed, or changed hands in the past year? I think they have to disclose that some in the franchise document, and then they're going to give you a list of franchisees to call, who are the happy ones, and you want to call some other ones, not those ones. You want to just go to the phone book and randomly start calling some owners and see what you hear. Then you want a job. My next question is, have you spent a day job shadowing an owner and operating this business? Because so many people have fantasies about franchise business operation that this is something, they're a dentist, they're a chiropractor, and they're thinking, I've got a lump of money I need to invest in something, and I could buy a franchise, and then it would magically be a cash machine that I would not have to pay any attention to. And I will not have to show up at this store or hire or fire, or I'll hire a manager and everything will just run like a top, because it's a franchise. And that is usually a sad misconception. That is not going to work out. You are going to need to operate the business 99% of the time.
Absolutely.
And if you don't like standing on your feet all day, talking to workers who speak English barely as a second language, buying a Subway may not be what you want to do, but you won't find that out till it's too late unless you job shadow. There's a lot of franchises that are service businesses. Go drive around with a BrightStar healthcare person and watch them make calls on people and try and sell that service to people all day long, and see if you find that fun and challenging, or if you would rather be shot than beat the street.
Yeah.
Day after day to drum up business, because that is what you do in service businesses. Marketing, and sales calls. So, you need to puncture the fantasies of what this is like and that these are magical cash machines. And then the other thing is to ask these owners if they would buy again, if they had it to do over again. Ask them if they would make more money if they, went and got a desk job somewhere. There's a lot of fantasies about how profitable this is going to be. And you should take your hint from the fact that most development of fast food restaurants now is multi-unit development. That's because each one is so barely profitable that you would need to operate 10 or 20 to have it actually be a living for you.
Now, tell me, in your experience over the last 15 years, what do you think is one of the biggest drivers of that myth, the myth that these are just cash machines, you open one up and you're on your way?
Boy, I don't know. The thing is that a lot of the failure in franchising goes on behind the scenes. The average person on the street probably doesn't know that a Quiznos is way less profitable than a Subway, and that their franchises are desperately unhappy people who are constantly suing Quiznos and getting multi-million-dollar settlements because they feel so ill-treated, they are overcharged for their goods, and they make all these allegations against the company, and they're unhappy campers. Kahala is another franchise system, still Cold Stone Creamery, that's been sued and sued. Yeah, people are oblivious to all they know is there's a Quiznos store down the block, and they don't know that the owner of that Quiznos store has changed 5 times in the last 5 years, because each person gets in, sizes it up, realizes it's a disaster, and sells it to the next sucker. You have to dig into what is going on and actually read these franchise disclosure documents and then start asking questions. Not read that and go, oh, okay. Yes, they have to disclose some useful things in there, but it's still spun the company's way. They're still putting the best possible light on the business in that document.
Well, that's true.
You're going to have to go out and start digging.
Yeah, and also in many of the requirements in the franchise disclosure document, there's averages as an example. Averages on what their profits are, and so it's so it's so geographic based that you're exactly right, and I tell people that all the time, and I really like your list of questions. I have a list as well, and all those questions are on it. I'm curious for the person out there who is considering franchise options right now, maybe hasn't made a decision. What would be the first thing that you would recommend that they do?
Well, usually by the time they get to me or anyone else, they've got an idea in their head of sort of what type of franchise they want to do. I guess there are people who are just like, I want to buy a franchise, I have no idea what. And they're really starting at ground zero. But most people I tend to encounter have a vague idea that they want to open maybe a Kumon Math Center or maybe a Subway. They have an idea of the type of industry they want to be in. And the thing nobody does is, okay, well then pull out the 6 top franchises in that niche and get all their franchise disclosure documents and compare them.
Yeah.
Who's growing? Who is closing a lot of units? And, how do their territories differ? One of the things that kills franchises and that franchisees complain about the most, to me anyway, is that their territory turns out to be not what they thought. And the next thing they know, the company seems to be opening a company unit of it across the street from them or down the block or, 1 mile away. And the business keeps eroding and eroding. So understanding, what are you buying? What are you getting here? How much territory, how much marketing help will you get? How much training are they going to give you? Because some of these franchisors, their training systems are very abbreviated. It's like 3 days when you join and good luck. And others are there the whole week that you open, and they come back a month later, and there's like 6 months of different training events, and then there's ongoing. There's big differences in how much support you are really going to get. Ask them how many people make up their franchise support organization. Do they have a real estate expert who's going to help you pick a location, or are you sort of on your own to figure that out? Find out what you're really buying for this royalty you're giving up and this big fat, $15,000, $20,000 of franchise fee you may be handing them on the top, from the start that you're never going to get back. What are you getting for that money? And talk to other franchises and find out if they fulfill on that, if they feel supported.
And I think, too, on a fundamental level, at least everybody that I speak to, I always try to learn a little bit more about their personality, because I certainly feel, and I'd be curious your thoughts on this, how personality plays into picking a franchise or in just figuring out if buying a franchise is right for you.
That's a really good question to ask, because some people are really going to hate being franchisees because they want to do their own thing. A lot of people quit their job in corporate America and they want to start a business because they hated having a boss. Then they get into a franchise system and wake up and realize it's the same thing all over again. It's the same darn thing. They're going to be told what to do, what they can advertise, when, what price they have to charge for X, and it drives them crazy. And then when they have creative ideas of how to improve the business, they're going to hit a stone wall with corporate. There are franchise organizations that are receptive to franchisee ideas and input and love them and implement them and spread them out chain wide. And, there's many great franchisees that a lot of the great ideas come from the franchise members. And there are other systems where it is their way or the highway. They are not interested in your insights, and generally the older the franchise system is, the more it gets entrenched and the harder it is. And that's another reason people buy into newer franchises, is they feel like they'll have more of an opportunity to be entrepreneurial and innovative and shape it, and that management will be more receptive. So yeah, you kind of need to find out how entrepreneurial a system it is, because some are and some aren't. And some will give you a lot of flexibility about how you're doing what you're doing and where you buy supplies and, what you want to put on special this month, and others will not.
Yeah, and I find the really good ones do value, they may not, you as an individual franchisee may not have a big enough voice in a large established franchise system, but certainly the good ones that I've seen through franchisee associations, sort of the power of the franchisee owner operators, if they get together that's actually one of the due diligence, questions and principles that I always encourage people to find out is how other franchisees have experienced that, because you really want that, as even though you're buying a set system, as we all know, I mean, things change over time, and you as the franchisee owner operator are right there on the ground that sees things day in and day out, where the franchisor back at the corporate offices just isn't seeing those same things. So you really need the franchisor to be open to those kind of suggestions.
Yeah, but even in the systems that are, the wheels of change turn slowly, and that's something you just have to realize. If you really want to do your own thing, be your own person, being a franchise owner may not be for you. If you are the kind of person who feels terrified about how to run a business and you feel like, I would like a ton of support and a manual that just takes me through it step by step and I'll just follow it and everything will work out, franchising could be great for you. I mean, the idea is that you're taking some of the risk out, but there's a lot of controversy about whether it really does, about statistics about how much more successful franchises are than mom and pops. And there's a lot of debate out there about how much we can really rely on the data that says franchising is more successful. I think franchising in a successful system is more successful. I don't know about it overall. I don't know if I would.
I think you're absolutely right, because the big myth is, you see numbers out there, and I've actually been at events, where people are selling franchises and they use these numbers, and it's I usually raise my hand and try to correct them, but they'll say, you have a 90% chance of success. And I go, no, that's just not true. I mean, that's an absolute lie. I mean, there's no other way to say that, because the numbers that they're calculating and basing that off of don't count as failures stores that resell. So in other words,
right.
If you buy
right.
a franchise, if I buy a Jimmy, if whatever franchise it is, okay, if I buy it and instead of going bankrupt, I just say, okay, I find another buyer who I'm going to resell to. Well, that's just like a failure in most instances, because if it was running very well and if it was profitable, you likely weren't going to sell. Now, there are exceptions to that, but those resells aren't counted as failures. And so it really skews those numbers. And in my experience, there really is any more likelihood of success in franchising than there is in just starting up a small business, with the exception of what you said. When you are in with a very experienced and good franchise system, you do have a little bit of a leg up on that.
Well, and as you say, you've picked a system that is a good fit for your personality. It's entrepreneurial and you're entrepreneurial. It's a service business and that's the kind you like. You've made those other matches and you're in a successful system. Yeah, you probably are in good shape. The question is finding that fit and really doing the homework to know that this system is a good investment. And these days, the thing is, when I started covering all this, it was a lot cheaper to get into a lot of franchises. There are some low-cost ones, obviously still around, but these days you can't open a fat burger, hole-in-the-wall franchise for like less than $750,000. And I was going to say that, to me, is the other big thing that I think people don't understand and that I think runs them into trouble, is how much cash you're going to need to get over the hump, the startup phase of this, to live on, to put into the business. I think people tend to not be on top of this, and then they run out of money. They're not understanding that they're not going to be able to take a dime out of this business for a year or two, and they need enough to live on from some other source all that time.
Yeah, in my experience, that's the biggest issue. That's my top issue that I find with people, is they're undercapitalized. Yeah. And, people think that they look at it with the rose-colored glasses on. They think, oh, well, I'll get this up and going, and that's not going to happen to me. And the reality is, I think you need at least 6 to 9 months of cash reserves or the ability to get capital, because you are going to go through a ramp-up period. There's just no question about it. It's very rare that you don't. And if you are that rare circumstance, then you're all the much better for it. But it's the people who have the capital or have the ability to get the capital that can make it through the early cycles. And I find that is a big, big problem in franchising. It's also a big problem, I think, in non-franchise businesses, because I see that a lot too.
Yeah, in startups in general, there's a tendency to just radically underestimate how long this is going to all take. And the formative experience that I had about this came when I was a secretary, and my boss had a cousin who was opening a restaurant. And it sounded great. It was going to be an Italian restaurant. It was going to be called Yo Mama's. And it just, and he had all these great old Italian recipes. And this just sounded fantastic. And then he started building out the restaurant. And he built and he built, and there were contractor delays and these kind of delays and that kind of delays. And meanwhile, he's paying rent. And eventually the restaurant never opened. He ran out of money, the end.
Wow.
And that was a really early formative piece of education to me about entrepreneurship, and how people underestimate what it is going to take financially to get the business open and run it while it, finds an audience, finds customers. It's not going to, I don't care what franchisors tell you, you're going to open that new, even McDonald's, and you're going to have to, it's not going to pull in 2.6 million the first year, like their average that they disclose tells you. That you're not going to earn that, and there's just so much to learn about budgeting and labor and the cost of goods. And, you're just going to be learning. And in the meanwhile, you're not operating, at super top efficiency, and you're not netting the the net income isn't there.
Well, and I find too, and I think this sort of underlines everything that we've been talking about, but one thing that I find franchise buyers never think about, and that is when it comes to buying a franchise versus a non-franchise is, in your example, when you have somebody who's invested time, energy, money in just starting their own restaurant, and at the end of the day, they run out of money and they're done. Mm-hmm. Well, in franchising, once you sign that agreement, you never get back your franchise fees. They're gone. And most franchise agreements are 5, 10, 15, some are even 20-year agreements. And so you're on the hook, and you either have to find somebody else to buy it or find a way out of the system. So it's all the more important, I think, in franchising to be very, very careful on the front end and do extra due diligence.
Yeah.
So.
And, the other thing that happens is people go through the process and they get interested, and then they go to the discovery day and just kind of sit there with their mouths open like kids on the It's a Small World ride, getting dazzled, getting dazzled by the excitement. And that is the point of Discovery Day, is to get you all pumped up about this concept, and you're going to talk to people who love it and are making buckets of money. And instead of using it as your opportunity to ask really hard questions about what is the background of the managers of this? What other businesses have they operated? How did those do? Did they sell them to a big corporation for billions, or did they go broke? What are you going to do for me if my business is floundering? What support is available? And then to go from there, out from Discovery Day, to talk to people operating the franchise and talk to people who operate the competing franchise. And start getting a feel for how happy franchisees are in this system. How much money are they really making? How many hours are they really having to work? Is another one that probably people radically underestimate just as much as the money. Try and get a real life picture of what this is going to be like. I think there's a lot of people who have been laid off by corporate America. Maybe they've got a severance package and they're too young to be just retired and give up, or they just don't have retirement money like many Americans, and they need something else to do, and so they open a business, and then they lose all their money, and then they get to get a job again.
Yeah, exactly. And
you want to avoid that. That is what you want to avoid.
Well, and I think underlying, and you've given so many great nuggets here, Carol. I really appreciate it. I mean, I think the audience is going to really benefit from this. I think, there's never a guarantee for success, right? I mean, whether you start your own business or whether you're buying a franchise, there's no guarantee for success. But you have to prepare for it. I mean, you have to go through a systemized process yourself of determining what franchise or what business is going to be right for you. Failing to do that is just a recipe for disaster. And I see that all the time.
It's never risk-free, but getting into business is never risk-free. But you can take a lot of the risk out of the equation by doing some real research, talking to franchisees who aren't the ones the company gives you, and really hanging out at that business, watching it operate, and really looking at their numbers and finding out, what it's all really about. I want to just say one sort of closing point. One of the big ways that a lot of people finance their franchise is through what's called a ROBS transaction, rollovers as business startups. And that's where you borrow money out of your 401k, set up a new 401k in the name of the business, put the money in there, and then you borrow it out tax-free. As you might imagine you might be asking yourself, how would that be legal? And the answer is it may not be. The IRS has taken an increasingly dim view of ROBS reactions and of ROBS transactions, I should say, and has warned repeatedly that they plan to review them all with an eye to disallowing them. There are still companies out there aggressively selling this to people. We'll help you do it and set it up. And I just want to say, at one point, I did a large investigative piece about this and talked to a lot of experts in franchise law and in tax law, and just don't do it is the conclusion. You don't want to do this. If you want to use your retirement money to start a business, first of all, it's a bad idea and I don't want you to. But if you're going to do it anyway, just cash it out and pay the penalty now. Don't do this maneuver where you set up the new 401k and then you borrow it out and you think you're not going to pay tax on it. You are going to end up paying tax and penalties and everything, is what IRS has repeatedly said. We are coming for these transactions. We're reviewing everyone. We think they are a scam. We think they're a tax dodge. And so just know that when it comes to financing your business, you look very hard before you engage in this transaction.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because quite frankly, whenever I mention that to people, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Most people don't even know that that's an option. And, there's really 3 companies out there that are selling these like crazy. One of them sort of finding the calling financial advisors, tax professionals, stuff like that, and asking if they've ever heard of them. And all of them, to a T, have talked about the fact to be very, very careful about that. In fact, recommending not to do it. So, yeah.
It's an arcane and complex, little-known transaction, and you'll see these people sponsoring conferences, and they'll tell you that we've set up thousands of these, and what they don't tell you is the IRS is planning to review every one of them because they believe they are fraudulent. And they have warned in a couple of different disclosure letters. And I believe in 2011, they started looking at them. They opened a unit, hired a group of people to just sit there and look at them. So you don't want to be here.
Well, that's a great point. I'm really glad you brought that up at the end thing. And I feel like we could have a whole nother show on that specifically.
Financing. Yeah.
It's such a big deal. But I know that you have a book, The Pocket Small Business Owner's Guide to Starting Your Business on a Shoestring. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I was approached to write that title by the publisher, Allworth Press. It's a series that they have, this Pocket Small Business Owner's Guide. And this book is all about how to save money in your business. And each chapter is an aspect of business, from market research to labor, facilities, marketing, sales, e-commerce, every aspect of business, and how to do it for free or for cheaper. And it really allowed me to boil down about 20 years of talking to business owners and watching businesses succeed and fail. And it's just got a lot of fun stories in it that are hopefully educational about why you want to develop a discipline of saving money in your business and postponing, avoiding, and reducing costs. So that's what it's all about. And the book site for that is shoestringstartupguide.com is where you find that.
And then if people want to reach out to you or talk to you more about this, you've got such great insight and experience. Where can they reach?
Well, you can always find me through caroltice.com, my writer's site, or, you can look me up on Forbes, on my Forbes blog, The Franchise Files.
Well, Carol, thank you so much. I love your passion, and I love all the great advice through this interview, and I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Hey, my pleasure.
All right, take care.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.